Audience members today are my brother via FaceTime call, my mom, and my dad as the camera person. Thank you. Okay. Once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered weak and weary, and so begins the most famous work of one poet shrouded in mystery. Through its sinister and winding atmosphere, the poem, The Raven, encompasses the fear and isolation that plague the writer throughout his life. Edgar Allan Poe. Like me, many of you have probably at one point heard of his work, or if not of his name. Personally, I feel as though a huge deal of influences have come from him to me. Today, I hope to shed some light on things that aren't typically talked about. Hello, my name is Alexander Huerta, and today I will be talking to you about the life, death, and influence Edgar Allan Poe had on the world beyond just literature. You might say, what's the point about talking about some old guy who died like 100 years ago? And to that I say, a pretty big one. That being simply that art influences art. In other words, maybe you don't like Poe, but you love horror or you love a good horror movie. And to that, I would say, where do we get these things from? What made horror or what makes horror horror? And to that, I would say a huge deal of influence has come from him and his unique voice that had never before been seen at that time. So when you think of horror, you may think of something else. But in reality, a huge deal of influence has come from Edgar Allan Poe himself. So in that regard, I feel as though it is important to talk about where we get these things from. So today I'll be talking to you about 3 specific instances I feel best encapsulate that. Edgar Allan Poe's childhood, his later life and work, and his death and what came after. I will start from the beginning at his childhood. He lived a relatively quick-paced life due to being orphaned at the age of 3 and having to move with what people presume to be either a godfather or a family friend. He attended school and then later attended college, in which his vices began being seen. He proceeded to gamble and lost a huge portion of his earnings, and as such, he was barred from attending college by his caretaker, and he was later fired from his job due to being intoxicated while working. This characterized him by the people of society as being a drunkard or possibly being under the influence of drugs. This brings me to my second point, that being that his life was influenced by the hardships that he faced. At an early age, he lived a very impoverished life, and that was worsened by the abuse of alcohol and gambling. In the excerpt that I read from you at the beginning, from The Raven, we can see feelings of dread and isolation take hold of him. This can be seen in other works, not just The Raven, such as Annabel Lee with love and then grief, with The Telltale Heart of paranoia and fear and hate, or The Mask of the Red Death with mortality. All of these encompassed what became Edgar Allan Poe's voice and unique perspective on things that had never before been seen. This brings me to my final point, that being that besides just being text on a page, his influence later shaped a large portion of what became life. For instance, like I said, art influences art. You may not like Poe, but you love Stephen King and Stephen King's work. And to that I say, where did Stephen King get his influence? He himself has said that a large portion of this influence has come from Edgar Allan Poe's line of work. And besides just that literature based himself, we see various examples of his work quoted or seen in pop media, such as his famous quotes of Nevermore or Quoth the Raven. But besides that, on a more personal note, I myself have always felt influenced by his work and his line of literature, and felt as though literature is a huge part of my life. When I think of what I'm going to do later in my life, it always comes back to being something based in literature. And in that case, I feel a huge part of that is due to Edgar Allan Poe's influence on me. And so, to that, I feel a huge part. I'm in debt to him, and I feel as though it's my responsibility to talk about him. In conclusion, I feel as though it's important to see and visualize how pieces of media are replicated and what can be derived from and what they're derived from themselves, and to see how important they really are. Edgar Allan Poe lived a hard life, but it is because of that hard life that we're able to see that is able to become beautiful things, such as horror or just modern life. So I challenge you, the viewer, to engage and see how something as small as a word or something as small as a line can have on influencing a culture or your world. And to that, I say thank you so much for watching today, and thank you so much for watching my video until the end.